Extreme radio for extreme times. This is A View from Space with the Spaceman on AM 640.
I'm the guy to call Space. You can email me at a couple spots, space at 640toronto.com and spaceman at 640toronto.com is the two addresses if you'd like to get in touch, got a comment, or some information. Yes, 3 types of money. Type 1, real wealth. Type 2, we've got pieces of paper that claim to represent real wealth. For example, a dollar that's connected to a gold standard. And then there's number 3, type 3, pieces of paper which represent actually nothing at all. But a government can actually force you to accept as money. It's called fiat money. The economies in type 1 are, of course, the healthiest, most prosperous. Type 2 economies that have gold-backed money, but not gold in your hand, but the paper in your hand, is associated with fraud all the time. And number 3, economies that are associated with type 3 money are rife with theft, because the disappearance of all the gold and silver invariably means that it's been stolen or misappropriated. So the idea, because of the bank stress tests this week, the idea is this. Let's print as much money as we can, come up with every damn excuse we can to keep printing this stuff until there's so damn much of it, it's worth nothing. And then they can crash your system and put the new one in place that was their intention all the time. Otherwise, why would very smart people that they say they have these talking heads that come on the television set saying, well, these guys know a hell of a lot more than we do, so they really know that this is the only way to fix the economy. Too big to fail. I say, if you're too big to fail, you're too big to exist. Get out of here. Collapse, die, go away. Oh, well, that's not the plan, and it's not going to happen, as you and I know. They have the license to print money, and they're going to print as much as possible to crash your system. Meanwhile, all the while telling you there's hope, that this could work. But it won't. They'll sell you on the hope thing over and over. Are you falling for this fraudulent scam? The largest fraudulent scam in the history of the entire world. Although the American Constitution explicitly forbids it, the United States went recklessly from type 1 money, real money, gold and silver, to type 2 money long ago. Type 2 money, of course, not your gold and silver, but paper that represents it. And you can go and get that paper, trade in that gold or that silver at any time you want. We are now irreversibly entrenched in type 3. Pieces of paper which represent nothing at all. What does this mean? It means that our complete net worths can be erased any minute of any day. And I can assure you, they will be before long. There is a day of reckoning coming. The problem isn't credit isn't available. The problem is there's a massive debt that's piling up. That's the problem. And if you don't deal with the debt problem, you're doomed. And they don't want you to think you could get rid of that debt because that's your prison. Yes, this day of reckoning is coming. You're going to wake up and find that your life savings have been devalued and that you've become worthless. On that day, you'll be forced to do whatever the Illuminati bankers demand. Unless you want to starve to death, that is. So the legal tender, type 1, gold, silver coins. The United States Constitution demands, to this very day, by the way, that the only legal tender in that country be gold and silver coins. That's Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 in the United States Constitution. Few Americans are aware of this fact. To most, the thought of a currency made up of coins seems like a very strange idea, or maybe even a joke. I'm saying coins because, you see, paper doesn't get it done. If you're supposed to be backed by gold and silver, then they should put the gold and silver in the coins and distribute the coins to the people. Then the wealth is actually being distributed amongst the people. The Founding Fathers put this into the Constitution for a very good reason. What is legal tender? This means the form of money which you are entitled to demand under the law as a payment of a debt. So gold coins are legal tender, if you can find any. But things like television sets, automobile tires, chickens, they're not. If somebody wants to pay you in chickens or car tires or a television set, for example, well, it's okay. But you can't be forced to accept chickens or car tires or television sets as a payment of a debt. You can be forced to accept gold coins if you can find any. Bankers hate gold and silver coins, except the ones in their pockets. Why? Because the gold and silver coins give you value, and they want all the value for themselves. Legal tender, type 2. Paper gold, silver certificates. That's paper that represents gold and silver locked away somewhere. What about systems using type 2 money? How do they work? In type 2 system, some of the gold and silver is removed from circulation and left in reserve in a safe location. In its place, paper appears. So if the United States has $1 trillion in gold and silver in Fort Knox, which it doesn't, then the government can leave all the gold and silver in the fort and issue instead $1 trillion in gold certificates or silver certificates, pieces of paper. Legal tender or money, passed off as that, which represent or claim to represent the real gold and silver locked up in the fort. By the way, governments all around the world, if you've been noticing in the last decade, have sold off all of their gold and silver. Guess who was buying? Yeah, the Illuminati, of course. That's the plan. If you're old enough to remember the Great Depression, you will without a doubt remember the gold certificates which the government forced you to accept in exchange for your real gold. In earlier times, those certificates, which have long since been removed from circulation, could be brought to the bank anytime and gold coins received in exchange for them. Now, if you became an adult, say in the 70s, you undoubtedly remember that back then a dollar bill in America was called a silver certificate. You could bring it to the bank and exchange it for silver coins anytime. Now both the silver certificates and silver coins are gone. What happened to all that gold and silver? To find out what the response was, you need to hear the decision handed down to a man called Ken Bygleason in a court case that he sued the federal court, or the Federal Reserve, in a federal court of law, asking who owned the gold that was there. The purpose of the lawsuit was to determine whether or not American people were sovereign in America, or whether the federal government has quietly established itself as a de facto dictatorship, as many already believe, myself included. A spaceman, AM 640, A View from Space. This case was inspired by a New York Times article which stated that the Federal Reserve Bank had at least 9,000 tons of gold bullion in the basement of its branch at Liberty Street in New York. The whereabouts of its other gold and silver holdings have not been discussed publicly, but are astronomical. Remember, the Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It is a private corporation owned by a handful of banks and a handful of Illuminati highly placed families. Although it's been highly publicized that foreign countries store gold in that same basement on Liberty Street in New York, it can't be denied that a lot of the gold and silver down there must be made up of bullion that formerly circulated as currency of the United States of America, expropriated during various Illuminati-controlled emergencies. The most famous of these emergencies was the bank panic of 1933, by a highly questionable act of Congress which made it a crime to possess any gold other than jewelry. Yes, I said possessing gold was a crime, except if it was in jewelry. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared a bank holiday, followed immediately by a highly questionable act of Congress which made it a crime to possess gold. Americans were ordered on pain of severe fine and imprisonment to hand over their gold in return for which they were given pieces of paper bearing the title Gold Certificate on it. Each of these bills bore the inscription redeemable in gold, a promise which obviously could never have been kept. The gold certificates were progressively placed in silver certificates, redeemable in silver, and a claim which goes beyond all reason into the realm of the absurd. When I was growing up, most all dollar bills in America were still being called silver certificates. The gold certificates were long gone. Now the silver certificates have long since been replaced. By what? By Federal Reserve notes, which are not redeemable at all. What's more, all the silver has been removed from all of their coins. So as you can see, there's a scam going on to separate the masses from their gold and silver and replace it with worthless paper. History, once again, repeating itself. Nothing new under the sun. Space back on AM 640 for the view from space in just a minute. So now that we all have silver and gold removed from all of our coins, we have an old paper currency with worthless coins made out of base metal. And the gold and silver is unaccounted for. It's presumed by the average person that the gold and silver is in, well, places like Fort Knox, which in reality only has a relatively small amount of show gold for the benefit of tourists, of course. Where's the rest? And who owns it? Well, this lawsuit that I was telling you about, Ken Bygleson versus the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This lawsuit presumes that most of the bullion, which underwrote the currency of the United States of America, the richest nation in the world, by the way, is in the basement of the Federal Reserve Bank and at other undisclosed Federal Reserve strongholds. This lawsuit's over 7 years old now, and at no time during the proceedings was this presumption actually denied by the bank in any way. That there was all this gold reserves stored at the Federal Reserve. They never denied it, not once. The question is, who owns the title to all that gold and silver? Well, there are three possible answers. The citizens of the United States holds the title. The Supreme Court noted in the 19th century, in 1882 to be exact, United States versus Lee, court case 106 of the U.S. Supreme Court, that the people of the United States are collectively the sovereign here, with all the rights formerly enjoyed by the King of England. If the people who own the gold and silver, and it is merely being held in trust for them by the Federal Reserve, then there's no problem, and this case can be put to rest. The citizens own the gold and the silver. That's possible answer number one. Possible answer number two. The Federal Reserve Bank holds the title. The private corporation. Remember that the Fed is a private, for-profit, money-lending institution owned by the Illuminati. All the bankers, all the elite rich families. If they claim to own this gold and silver, then big questions need to be asked, like, who sold it to them? How did they pay for it? The truth is, it was expropriated from the United States, within which the only constitutional legal tender is gold and silver coins. Constitution Article 1, Section 10. How can you pay for gold and silver with more gold and silver? You wind up with the same thing. And if not gold and silver, then with what could it have possibly been purchased with? And if it wasn't paid for, and believe me, it wasn't, then how can they own it? Possible answer number three. The United States holds the title. It may seem obvious to presume that the gold and silver in the United States is owned by the United States. Unfortunately, U.S. Supreme Court declared in 1945, Hooven versus Evatt, case number 324 in U.S. Supreme Court, there are two United States. One, the one we're taught about in school, consists of 50 states united by and under the Constitution, within which all constitutional law is preserved. If this United States owns the gold and silver, then it's the same as saying that the gold and silver are the property of the popular sovereignty, meaning the citizens of the United States collectively, and there's no problem. The other United States, though, consists of the territories, possessions, and persons under the jurisdiction of the federal government, within which there are no constitutional rights. This second description of the United States is governed by Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the Constitution, which establishes a virtual congressional dictatorship over the whole country. The Supreme Court has declared in no uncertain terms that constitutional rights do not exist in this other United States. Guess which United States American citizens live in? The one with the constitutional rights that owns all the gold and silver? Not a chance. They live in the other one. If you file an income tax return, or if you pay into or receive Social Security, then you have unknowingly acceded to federal sovereignty. And believe it or not, you have no constitutional rights other than those the government magnanimously grants you. So if this other United States owns the gold and silver, it is the same as it being owned by the Federal Reserve Bank, since no one in Congress, no one intends to not be elected. So no one will dare challenge the bank's possession, because they've proved over time stand in the way of the bank, and the bank takes you out. The trouble with systems employing Type 2 money, Type 2 money again, paper that represents some gold and silver, that backs them. The trouble with it is that people are greedy without exception. Every nation which has used Type 2 money has printed more paper bills than were gold and silver coins behind them. So, if Fort Knox had $1 trillion in gold, which again it doesn't, the government would sooner or later succumb to the temptation of printing $2 or maybe even $3 trillion or even more in paper. And it's been done. Everything's fine as long as everyone doesn't run to the bank simultaneously for their gold. But sooner or later, something will scare people, and they will indeed run the banks. Then the system collapses because there's simply not enough gold and silver to pay on all those certificates. That's exactly what happened. The exact thing happened in 1933, in the midst of the Great Depression. There was a nationwide run on the bank. Why? Because there was a rumor abroad that all gold was going to disappear, which in fact is exactly what happened. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a loyal bank servant, dutifully removed all the gold from circulation at that point. This was the culmination of a plan which was many, many years in the making. It didn't just happen. In that year, 1933, all citizens of the United States were ordered, under threat of severe fine imprisonment, to hand their gold in exchange for a piece of paper called a gold certificate. It looked just like $1. Except it said gold certificate at the top, and it said, in gold coin payable to the bearer on demand, at the bottom. What? What kind of gobbledygook was that? I just told you, people were ordered at the pain of $10,000 fine, a king's ransom during the Depression in the 30s, and 10 years in prison to hand over their gold. So what does it mean to tell the same people who had just been fleeced that any old day of the week, whatever one they wanted, they could stroll over to the bank with their paper money and get their gold back? If a bank teller had accidentally given you gold then, and you got caught on the way out the door, you and the teller would go straight to jail. This was neither the beginning of fraud, nor the beginning of treason in the banking system, but it was the most blatant example of it in the history up to this time. Later on, all gold coins and all gold certificates were replaced by other pieces of paper called silver certificates, as I was saying. What a joke. If there wasn't enough gold to back the currency, how in the world could there have been enough silver? We were simply moving along the pathway of out-and-out fraud. And it has only gotten worse, especially in this last decade, with all the banking instruments, or investment rules, and all the new money-making instruments being introduced. What about Type 3 money, where the government declares that money is pieces of paper which have no value whatsoever? That is exactly where we are right now. Our money is intrinsically worthless. In the early 70s, the last scrap of silver was removed from the lawful treasuries of the United States into the vaults of private bankers. The silver certificates were replaced by Federal Reserve notes, which cannot be redeemed at all. They're nothing but plain paper, and there's nothing to back them. If you're searching for a reason why you're getting poorer and poorer, and you can't seem to get ahead, and why your dollars are buying less and less, look no further. You've just heard the reason. Spaceman AM 640, View from Space. As long as people trust in these Federal Reserve notes, they will have purchasing power. The minute people lose confidence in them, they become transformed back into plain paper with no purchasing power at all, not even worth the paper they're printed on. Not a good situation. People think the basis of money is gold. They're wrong. The basis of money is debt. statement was originally attributed to one of the Rothschilds, expressing a simple but immensely important truth. It is the core reality of the current world banking system you and I live in and have to exist with. And it absolutely, without a doubt, leads to pure fraud. If you learn nothing else about money, learn tonight the meaning of that statement. People think that the basis of money is gold. They are wrong. The basis of money is debt. Let me illustrate concept. Imagine that you borrow $100 from a friend. You agree to pay him back exactly 1 year later, and you agree once more to pay him 10% interest. So he gives you he gives you $1,000 now, and later you pay him back $1,100. Simple enough? So now he'll undoubtedly ask you to sign for the loan. That piece of paper you sign is called a promissory note. It's your promissory note, and that is your promise to pay back the loan plus the interest. Now think about this. That promissory note has value. Do you doubt it? If your friend comes on hard times, he can sell that note, can't he? Sure he can. As long as you're good for the money, that note is worth the face value of $1,000 plus that $100 additional you agreed to pay on as interest. So it's potentially worth $1,100. Whoever holds that note is in position to collect that $1,100. It's most assuredly got value. Your friend would have a hard time selling it for the full $1,100, but if he plays his cards right, he can probably get more than $1,000 because it's worth more than $1,000. Suppose, for example, the buyer pays $1,050 for this promissory note. At the end of the year, he'll collect the full $1,100. That's $50 more than he paid for it. So without doing any work, he makes a fast $50. What's wrong with that? The only risk is that you might fail to pay back the loan. So any sale of a promissory note, there's risk. The better you are as a credit risk, however, the more your promissory note will be worth. Space, back with more in just a minute on AM 640.
The opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of AM 640. Deprogramming the brainwashed simply by uncovering the truth. He's the Spaceman with a view from space on AM 640.
The Spaceman, two addresses to communicate with me through the email is space@640toronto.com or spaceman@640toronto.com. And thanks so much for the ones I've already received tonight. I appreciate that so much. People think that the basis of money is gold. They are wrong. The basis of money is debt. I hope you walk away with just one thing tonight, at least, and it's that, to learn from that. So I told the story of you borrowing $1,000 from a friend, 10% interest. That's $1,100. In 1 year you pay him back. Simple enough. You hand him a promissory note. He can sell that promissory note. It actually could be used as money. So it's potentially got value. The promissory note has value. Believe it? Whoever holds that note is in a position to collect $1,100. And maybe he can't get the full price for it. Suppose, for example, he gets $1,050 for the note. Well, he paid $1,000 for it, and he got a free $50 bill, and he didn't do any work for it. He makes the fast $50. So the only real downside to promissory notes, you see, as having value is that you might fail to pay the loan back. So in any sale of a promissory note, there's risk. The better you are as a credit risk, the more your promissory note will be worth. Now, I told you that story to say this. In case you're not aware of it, know now that the world is full of promissory notes, and that most of them do, in fact, get sold. Loan agreements are promissory notes. Mortgage agreements are promissory notes. And even charge card slips are promissory notes. It is said by those who pay attention to such things that if you pay off a home mortgage and demand to have your promissory note returned to you, the bank will. They will return that promissory note to you. What you'll see is that it is literally covered with stamps. Promissory stamps, because these things are sold over and over and over again. One person buys them and shoves them on to the next person, sells them to the next guy, and they're making money each time it's sold. So what you see is that it is literally covered, the world is covered with promissory notes. Each one attesting to the fact that it was bought and sold repeatedly throughout its life, with the stamp on it. Loans are resold over and over and over and over and over. Speculators from all countries do this all the time. These promissory notes are considered highly desirable, and by the time they are paid off in full, they have literally traveled around the world and make millions more dollars than they're worth. So you see how the paper game is so out of whack. So I hope that through that example is that you can see a promissory note has value. But is it money? How to package a promissory note to make it look like money is the trick. And it's simply done. Have you ever seen a United States savings bond? Canada savings bond? They're among the commonest forms of gifts for life cycle events like weddings, baptisms, bar mitzvahs, things like that. What is a U.S. or a Canadian savings bond? It's a promissory note, packaged to look a lot like money. When you buy it, however, you pay less than the face value. That's why people like to give them as gifts. A $100 bond makes a great gift, but it only costs about $80. Price depending, of course, on the interest rate. That money, the $80, is a loan from you to the government. They will take your money, or the real money, and invest it. The government, being the most leveraged investor of all, will make a lot of money on your loan, and they will therefore be able to pay you back with interest and still be way ahead of the game. When the bond matures, you will be able to cash it in for the full $100. The government, of course, will have made more than $100 on your money. But what's it to you? They made money, you made money. Everybody's happy, right? Now, think of what a United States savings bond looks like. It looks a lot like money. Suppose you owed a man $100 and your business had just failed, and you had no cash to pay the man. If you had a mature $100 U.S. savings bond, the man just might accept the bond as payment for the loan. In fact, if he needed the money fast, then even if the bond had not actually matured fully, he still might even accept it. He would just have to wait till it matures, especially if he thought that he couldn't collect any other money from you any other way. U.S. savings bonds look like money, and they act like money. See, these U.S. Treasury Bonds are being bought and sold around the world, and they're valueless. China is sitting on trillions worth of them. Because they look like money, they act like money, but they're not legal tender. Why? Because you can't force anyone to accept them as payment of debt. The acceptance has to be voluntary. Okay, I'll take it because maybe there's no other way I can get the money out of you. But if you're bankrupt, a creditor will accept the bonds if he thinks he won't otherwise get his money from you, right? Any government wanting to expand its currency and knowing these facts about promissory notes might ask this question. So how can we force the citizens to accept this promissory note as if it were real money? Think about this. The government is continually borrowing money, repaying old loans, borrowing new money all over again. Each loan transaction generates a promissory note. If the government could somehow, by some subterfuge, find a way to package these promissory notes to make them look like money and circulate them as such, then the government could be awash in new money, created without the need to go mine gold, operate businesses, or raise taxes. What a deal! More money? No work. And I know, when I just said that, a light went off in your head and you said, you don't get anything for free. Right! Exactly. You get into debt. So how do you do it? In the 19th century, the American government asked just that question. You'll be astonished and disappointed at the answer they came up with. During the Civil War, paper money is introduced to America. To get the people to accept promissory notes as money, you first have to get them to accept paper money. Remember, in the States, the only lawful currency was, and still is, legally gold and silver coins. The dollars are just notes, promissory notes, for that gold and silver. The Civil War gave the government the excuse it needed to begin experimenting with paper. Although the Civil War ended slavery, not the real reason for the war, by the way, you must remember that no other Western nation had slavery either. England even freed her slaves before America did, and they did it without a war. America was the only nation that needed a civil war to end slavery. So was the war really necessary? The answer is no. Then what was the true reason for the Civil War? I'll give you a hint, but this is another show at some other time on A View from Space on AM 640. Abraham Lincoln, the man they are most often sinking with, Barack Obama, needed money to finance this war. The European bankers offered him large quantities of money at interest rates so exorbitant that he said, I've got two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the bankers in the rear. Of the two, the one at my rear is my greatest foe. Wow. Now we're beginning to touch on the truth about the American Civil War. Lincoln told the bankers to go to hell. He printed his own money. These bills, which had nothing behind them except Lincoln's solemn promise to redeem them in gold after the war, which he did do, in fact, were called greenbacks. Called that because of the green paper they were printed on. But, between you and I, also another reason was an invocation of the green man Osiris, the highest deity in the ancient mystery Egyptian religion, known as the Green Man, the original Green Man. They circulated, and the people accepted them. Amazing. Don't forget that the only money circulating in America at that time was gold and silver coins. The acceptance by the people of pieces of government paper masquerading as money was an enormous vote of confidence in the integrity of the government. Of course, this sort of trust in the government is easier to elicit when there's a war going on. Oh, sure, anything you tell me. It's okay, all right. Space back in a minute on AM 640 with A View from Space. Spaceman, the guy they call Space on AM 640. You can email me at space@640toronto.com or spaceman@640toronto.com. Just telling the story about Abraham Lincoln. needing to finance his war. The Civil War. European bankers offered him a lot of money at high, exorbitant interest rates. To which he said, I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the bankers in the rear. Of the two, the one at my rear is my greatest foe. Yes, you see, Abraham Lincoln wasn't about to take the loans and put the country in such a large debt it wouldn't be paid off for a long, long time. So he decided to print his own money. Other men that came after him, that tried to do what Abraham Lincoln did, also met the same fate. So he actually got the people, talked the people, very popular president, talked the people into accepting greenbacks masquerading as money. Saying at the end of the war, and we didn't even know who was going to win, that he would redeem them for gold and silver. Those greenbacks. And he did. But the people bought it because this sort of trust can only be elicited out of the mass population through fear. There was a war going on. There was no other way out, they were told. So what's wrong with printing greenbacks? Money that's not based on anything? Two things. The Constitution forbids it. Any legal tender except gold and silver coins. If any provision of the Constitution is flagrantly violated in the United States for any reason, then an evil precedent has been established. Paper money is inflationary is the second reason. The economists all agree that the dumping of unbacked paper money into the marketplace causes all prices to rise. Okay? The printing of the greenbacks caused the bankers to burn with rage. Their plan had been to gouge America with high interest loans. Now their money was no longer needed. And a lot of people who've researched this subject, myself included, believe that John Wilkes Booth was an agent of the Illuminati, the bankers, controlled by the Illuminati, to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. During the Civil War, the bankers ranted and railed against Lincoln in the newspapers, emphasizing the greenbacks were unconstitutional and inflationary. What hypocrisy! Wait until you see what the bankers did when they finally got their power to print money. Well, you've already seen, haven't you? It's just $787 billion stimulus package signed by Barack Obama. Take into account inflation. The moment the last pen signed his last Barack Obama on that paper, making that paper law, that $787 billion morphed through inflation immediately to $7.9 trillion. Already in a $60 trillion debt. What's another few trill? Anyway, after the war, some or most of the greenbacks were retired. This means that people brought them back to the banks, and true to Lincoln's word, the banks exchanged them for real gold and silver coins. But apparently the greenbacks were not all destroyed. In 1878, a law was passed that brought them back out. In other words, the government, seeing an opportunity to expand the currency, seized the moment and did it. Think about what that means. These greenbacks, pieces of intrinsically worthless paper, were sitting there in dark vaults doing nothing. Then, by a highly questionable act of Congress, the greenbacks were then taken out of retirement, reissued as money. So without raising taxes, or doing any work at all, or mining any gold at all, the government gave itself millions of dollars worth of new money What a deal. If you were a government employee, you could have suddenly found yourself being paid in greenbacks. You did real work, but the government paid you in paper, which it did not work for. There are many who would say that that wasn't right. It wasn't fair either, other than according to the ancient maxim, might makes right. The Greenback Scam was generally accepted by the people of America with little protest, but not entirely without protest. Some people were furious. One of these men was Mr. Juilliard, who sold a Mr. Greenman 100 bales of cotton for $5,122.90. When it came time to pay, Greenman coughed up $22.50 in gold, 40 cents in silver, and $5,100 in U.S. notes, meaning greenbacks, intrinsically worthless paper. Juilliard refused to accept the paper from Mr. Greenman. He also sold real cotton, he said, and I don't want paper imitations of money. I want real money in return for my real cotton, not paper play money. So Greenman refused to pay. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, Juilliard versus Greenman, 1884. The decision of that court was a major landmark in the history of the destruction of American constitutional rights. Some call it treason. I agree. You decide for yourself. The job of the court in Juilliard versus Greenman was whether the unbacked paper money notes of the United States federal government, which were masquerading as money, could be considered a legal tender. Remember, the phrase legal tender refers to that which you can be forced to accept as payment of debts. Are unbacked government notes, for example, pieces of paper with nothing behind them, except a promissory note to someday redeem them in gold, a promise which is very unlikely to be kept, a form of legal tender? Well, the Supreme Court was asked to decide if this worthless paper should be forced to be accepted. So what do you think happened? As the text of the court's decision makes clear, the law was hardly considered in this case. The real consideration at hand was that the United States in 1884 was destined by the Illuminati to be made into a world power and needed more money for imperialistic expansion. This world power business was intoxicating stuff, causing those who believed it to lose sight of what America was and what the word freedom really meant. So, as you've probably already guessed, the court decided in favor of Juilliard. The court declared that the government's paper was indeed money, and that no American had the right to refuse to accept it. So in a land where a constitution forbids to this day any form of legal tender other than gold and silver coins, worthless paper money suddenly was thrust upon them. On that day, the floodgates of tyranny were very quietly opened. It's over 100 years later now. That was in 1884. So, those floodgates, now hanging wide open, like a gaping surgical wound, could no longer be closed quietly. So how did the court justify this wanton attack on the Constitution of America? They justified it on the grounds of sovereignty. Who's in charge here? Sovereignty means king. up until the Julliard versus Greenman case, this is the Supreme Court openly declaring that the United States, the people, are collectively the sovereign. They have no king. The people are the sovereign. Don't forget that the single, all-encompassing philosophical basis of the American Revolutionary War supposedly was to reject the belief that man had to live under a king, wasn't it? And that's what they told everybody they fought for. Isn't that what you were taught in school in history? Isn't that what they still teach in school? If you take history, you don't have to take it, and it's not compulsory anymore. They just want to hide the truth, that's why. Well, guess what? That's not true anymore, and it hasn't been since 1884, the year the Supreme Court ever so quietly announced that the United States federal government was the sovereign. That means, in effect, the United States federal government was the king. Just took the place of the king. America got a new king. Here's how they did it. In the first place, they, the Supreme Court panel of judges which presided over the Julliard versus Greenman case, noted that even through the Constitution, which forbids any form of money other than gold and silver coins in various states, it did not forbid other forms of money in federal transactions. And that's true. The U.S. federal government indeed has the right to pay anyone in any way it pleases as long as the transaction's legal and as long as the other party agrees. But it has to be voluntary. Or you go back to the old damn gold and silver story. We're going there. Because I don't want that. I want the gold and silver. This means, for example, that if America buys something from France, the deal can be paid with a piece of paper or any other commodity which France is willing to accept. The federal government does not have to limit itself to gold and silver in its own transactions. But the court admitted that this does not entitle the government to force you to accept their notes. You are an American citizen, supposedly with full constitutional rights. In your case, acceptance of the government's notes is supposed to be voluntary. Those notes are not legal tender in America.